Okay, so objects, objects and modules in Perl. Okay, so the first big thing is that essentially in Perl, a class is created using a package. Or a Perl construct that's called a package. And objects, individual objects, so instances of objects, or instances of a class, use an anonymous hash table to represent or store their instance variables. So you won't see a class keyword in Perl 5. Starting in Perl 6 you do, but for this course you don't see a class keyword. It uses the package mechanism, and instances of a class, they represent their instance variables using an anonymous hash table. So the way that you declare a class is with the keyword package, and you would give it the name of the class, such as student, and then a semicolon. And at the end of the package, you need to remember to end it with a statement, or an expression rather, that returns a true value. And that's just a quirk of the Perl package system. So by convention, that expression is simply 1. So that's the last statement in your file. You typically put 1 class per file, just like in Java. You may put a class in the same file, especially if it's a one-off program, in which case you need to put the class in parentheses. I'm sorry, not parentheses, curly braces. And that offsets the package from the rest of your program. So should you wish to put the class definition in the same file as the program that uses it, put curly braces around each of your classes. But if you are putting the class into a separate file, which is more typical, you don't need the curly braces anymore. Okay? Now, the mechanism by which you create an object, you still use a constructor. But in Perl, you don't. In C++, what is the constructor? And in Java, it's the name of the class. That's not true in Perl. In Perl, you can name your constructor whatever you want. And the common convention is to use the new function as the name of the constructor. And there's no special syntax for declaring a function as a constructor. But there is a command called bless, which we'll see in a moment, that is used to create or to say that this is, in effect, an instance of student. So you typically start out, the first argument to the constructor is going to be the name of the class. It's actually, in this case, student is this particular one. So it's literally a character string that is the name of the class. And then after that, you have any user-supplied arguments. Okay, and this would obviously, you would use a comma-separated list right there. You should use my here in order to declare everything as local. So that should be your first statement, is unpacking it. Your second statement, so I'm just numbering these, okay? You obviously don't number these in your real program. The second thing you do is you create the hash table. And you, by convention, use $self for that. In C++ and Java, the variable is this, but in most scripting languages, they've adopted the convention of self as the name for the reference to the object. And you create an empty hash table. So that's an empty hash table. So don't put anything into it just yet. The third thing you do is something unusual called bless. So this is a function that says, that associates the hash table with the instance of student. In fact, says this hash table now represents an object that is an instance of student. Let me make sure I get the bless right. It is, okay, self is first. So first argument is the pointer to your hash table. The second is the name of the class. So that's step 3, is to call the bless command. Step 4 is to make your assignments. Okay, so assign values to instance variables. So let's say that in this case, one of the user-supplied arguments was a name. So there's 2 ways to do it. In the notes, I introduced a new notation, so I'm going to use it here. So another way to dereference in Perl is to dereference just like you would in C++ or Java with a pointer, with an arrow. And if you're wondering where I came up with $name, it would be in these user-supplied arguments. So one of these would be $name. You could also have simply written it as $self name equals, in this case, $name. Either one is fine. Okay, and I don't care which one you use on the homework assignment. Okay, so that's step 4. And I'm just going to do ... to indicate there might be some more of that going on. And then step 5 is to return the pointer, which is self. Okay, so those are the magic recipe for creating a constructor. The way Perl knows it's a constructor is because of the bless command. You are allowed to create multiple constructors for a single class. However, you cannot overload the name of the constructor the way you do in C++ and Java. Instead, you have to give unique names to your constructor. So I could have a second constructor here. Maybe I would call it subMakeStudent. And it would also have a bless in it. with $self and $class, and it would have all of the other accoutrements that I had in the previous one. So 1, 2, this would be the third step. And Perl would know that makeStudent was also a constructor because of the bless command. Now, it's not actually, that's not really the reason Perl knows that it is a constructor. Perl actually knows that something is a constructor based on the way you create an object. So to create, so that's the constructor. To create an object, you give the constructor name, so let's say new, $S. Equals new, and then you give the name of the class, and then whatever arguments, or $S equals make student. So the way it knows, in general, the syntax is S equals constructor name, class name, and then your arguments. So that's the general technique, and that, in fact, is how Perl knows that the constructor name is a constructor is because of the specific syntax you used. And when you use that syntax, it will automatically pass as the first argument the name of the class, which, conveniently enough, is right there for it. So it's very easy for the interpreter to pull off this stunt. Okay? And then you can get at the, well, let's go back. That's creating an object. So we just went through how you create a constructor and how you use it. For the methods, it's very similar to what you have already seen before, hopefully, in C++. So here's a getter function that accesses the name field. And just as in C++ and Java, the first argument is a pointer to the object, which in this case is what? Pointer, what's the pointer to? The hash table. So the pointer that is passed as the first argument is a pointer to the hash table. And just as in C++ and Java, you do not need to explicitly, in fact, you do not explicitly pass this pointer. It's passed implicitly. And then any additional arguments are arguments that were provided by the user. So the method names or member functions look just like they would in C++ or in Java. So that's not particularly difficult, shouldn't be particularly novel for you. Okay? And then to access the methods, it looks just like C++ in that you're using the arrow operator to dereference the method name. So you'd use the arrow, not dot, but an arrow to call a member function. And you will see this kind of unusual syntax. This syntax gives you access to the hash table. Okay, kind of weird, but it does look like the $self dereferencing that I used a moment ago, right? Do we agree with that? So what does that say about access protections in Perl? If I can pull that stunt. There are none. Everything is public. Okay? So I have a comment there that says it's frowned on, but there's nothing to stop you from going in and directly accessing the instance variables. The recommended way to do it is to use getter and setter functions like I did, but there's no language way to enforce it. That's more of a convention. Okay? So questions about that. That's pretty much the creation, the declaration of a class, the creation of an instance, and its usage in a nutshell. Okay, I think the real difference lies in the constructors and the use of package rather than class to create it. Everything else is pretty similar to C++ or Java. Obviously, the hash table and bless command are what make the constructor rather unusual. Okay, we're good with that? Okay, so, before I forget, you don't store packages in .pl files, you store them in .pm files for Perl module. So that's something, it's important because the way that you import something is with the use command. So to import a class, you would say use and the class name. And if you named the file brad.pl, it won't load. The Perl interpreter looks only for files with a .pm extension. So if I name that file brad.pl, the use command will not find it. So that is important. The interpreter assumes you name the packages or the package files with a .pm suffix. Okay. So, Perl also supports inheritance. Okay? And the way you do it is you start with the package name as before, then you use a require command to load the appropriate package. So require and use are essentially the same, except that require will actually terminate your program if the expected module cannot be found and use won't. Okay, so require and use are both import statements, with require saying terminate immediately if I can't find it, and use, I believe, gives a warning if it can't find it. So we actually are importing, so the second step is import the superclass. Then, so step one was name the subclass. Step 2 was import the superclass. And step 3 is to make the association. So make the association between the sub and superclass. Using the ISA array. So you give a list of comma-separated names of superclasses. So the fact that it's an array means what kind of inheritance is supported in Perl. There's a word for this. Pardon? What? It calls it what? Well, that's fine that they call it mixins, whatever. Looking for a word, not single, but, there we go, multiple inheritance. Perl supports multiple inheritance, and it is a depth-first type of inheritance. So if I had two classes, A and B, and I did not declare a method name in my subclass, it will first exhaustively search A's inheritance hierarchy looking for that method before it goes and searches B. So it uses what's called a depth-first search to resolve method names. I'm not going to test you on that because I think multiple inheritance is for the birds. And so does Java, which is developers, which is why they nuked it when they designed Java. But just telling you that it exists. Okay. So those are the three, well, really it's just the two magic things, the require statement and then the ISA array. Then there's a little bit of magic in the constructor. Perhaps ugliness would be a better word for it. So you no longer use bless. This is what I consider the ugliness because it's inconsistent. I hate inconsistency in languages. Adam's sitting up here laughing his head off. Okay, so I agree, this looks ugly. The only time you use bless is for your top level objects that are at the top of the inheritance hierarchy. If you are a subclass, you use this hideous notation right here to call your superclass constructor. And as you can see, you have to name the superclass constructor because there may be multiple superclass constructors. So you use super : new, and then you pass in whatever user provided arguments are expected. Now, does anyone see something that really is also hideous about this statement right here? It's subtle, but it's hideous. What is $class? Is it a reference? No, it's not. It's a string. But Perl somehow figures out that it's supposed to be a call to the superclasses module, and everything works out just grand. Okay? So it all works. The implementers of the virtual machine make it work, but I just find that to be god-awful. Okay? It's priceless, actually. So you just have to essentially memorize it. Okay? Now, this also is the reason you don't go hard coding the name of the class in the top level constructor. Okay, I didn't make this point earlier, but I will now. Okay, don't, when you do bless, don't hard code the name of the class. Because you actually might be blessing a subclass. So if you hard code the name, you're going to bless that subclass to be the wrong thing. You're actually going to make the subclass be an instance of you. So don't go hard coding the name of the class in there, or you're going to mess everything up. This is just beautiful. Okay, this is honest to God beautiful. Okay, I'm being sarcastic. So, okay, so other than that, the constructor for a subclass looks just like the constructor for a superclass. So we're missing the creation of an anonymous hash table because that's done for us by the superclass constructor. And we're missing the bless because that's done for us by the superclass constructor. So the superclass constructor takes care of the, so superclass constructor creates the hash table and blesses the hash table. I wonder if anyone ever interviewed Larry Wall to ask him how he came up with the word bless. That would be interesting. So, those two statements. Otherwise, the subclass constructor looks the same. Try to name the constructor for the subclass the same as the constructor for the superclass. It's not required, but it makes everybody's life simpler. Okay? In general, we try to name the constructor new. Why? Because conventions make it nice and easy so that anyone looking at your code seeing new knows that it's supposed to be a constructor. So try to, if you're only going to use one constructor, to name it new. Okay? So, questions about that? And again, the only reason that I have these curly braces here is because I was using this subclass in the same file as the program. But if I put it in a separate file, I don't need to do anything. Also, if you notice, I'm not positive about this. I'm not sure why this worked without a semicolon at the end of it. It may be that the subroutine declaration somehow returned a true value, or it may be that putting it in the file doesn't require it to end with one semicolon, but a safety thing would be to always put it there. Okay? So questions about inheritance. We good? No? We are? Okay. Well, we're not good, but we understand it. Okay. Actually, here's the one other thing. There is a slightly simpler way to create a subclass that combines the require and is a statements, and that is to just say use base student. And I believe require base student would work equally well. So if you say base, it means base class, like in C++. So it automatically sets up the @isa array for you. So if you want to simplify your creation, that's good. Oh, and by the way, that's part of the quiz today, is there's 2 different ways to set up subclasses. So this is one way, and the @isa is the other way. Okay, so there's one of your multiple answer questions. Okay, so last thing about Perl modules. So remember, classes actually use the Perl module mechanism. And actually the Perl module mechanism, for some reason, it seems like they should call them Perl packages, because after all, that is the name of the keyword. But in practice, everyone talks about Perl modules. But you see here, modules are actually a subclass of package. They are simply libraries of functions. So it's kind of like this. Here you have the universe of packages. And roughly speaking, some of them are libraries of functions that are called, and we call them modules. And the other half are classes. And I'm sure that you can find some other things, but I'm just saying that really modules are a subset of the packages. Modules are the name we attach to libraries of functions. But classes are a second distinct subset of packages. Okay? So there's a whole bunch of boring stuff that you can read for yourself, and I'll let you do so. Okay? The things that you want to do when defining a module is to use the exporter module. So what do we actually see here? Based on these 2 statements, what is every module? Every module is actually a class, in some sense. It's an instance of a exporter. So it's using the exporter module to inherit functions that export its own functions and variables. So in some sense, every package is really a class, but we distinguish between things that we mean to use as classes versus things that we mean to use as modules. But this is true of every module. So when defining a module, okay, use the exporter class. Okay, and it will provide functions that export your functions. Okay, the next 2 things that are important are these 2 lists, the export list and the export underscore OK list. I know I'm calling them lists, they're really arrays, and they are comma-separated lists of function names. The @export list is the default list of functions to export. And the export OK is an additional list of functions that are OK to export, but will not be imported by default. So the export list is the default set. The export OK is an additional set. So should those two lists be disjoint? Yeah, they are. Just seeing if you're paying attention. So yeah, they should be disjoint. I know, it sounds like a trick question, but it wasn't. Just wanted to see if you all were paying attention. Okay, so that's the second thing. So this is one, you require the exporter class and set it up, and two, you set up your export lists. Okay, so step one was to import them. So step one was to establish link with exporter class. And step two is to set up export lists. And notice it's all capital letters. And then it's just a list of functions. So these things don't have constructors. It's just a list of handy functions. Like it could be a math module, could be a module for manipulating GIF files. It could be a module for helping you to create PDF files. Okay, and you need to remember that it ends with a 1 semicolon, or any true value works, but that's the common use. Now, if you want to import modules into your program, you do it with use or require, either one. If you simply provide the name of the package, it imports your export list. That's the default list. If you specify a list of names, it no longer imports the default list. Instead, it only exports the names that you provide, and it makes sure that it's on one of those two lists. If you want to import a set of functions and you want, in addition to have all of the default ones, you use the :default keyword. And actually, if you're going to ask what if you want to include all of the optional ones, I don't know off the top of my head. I'm sure there's a way to do it. So the final one says import all the default functions plus the array print function. Anyone know what QW is doing there? You all are such good readers. Brian. Like the QWERTY TW or what?
Colon QW for them.
No. Yes.
It makes each element of the array a quoted word.
Yes, it makes each element of the array a quoted word. So QW stands for quote word. Okay, so it's actually a function that returns, in this case, for the first one, it returns the quoted list array print. In the second case, it returns the quoted list :default, comma, array print. So it's often used as a way to avoid a lot of quotes and commas. So it stands for quote word. It's just a function that takes a list and it returns a comma-separated list of quoted words. Okay. By default, you typically don't export variables. You only export your you only export functions. Okay. You can export variables, but the convention is that modules are libraries of functions. You don't export variables because what would that tend to do? Pollute your namespace and potentially clash with variables that you've already used. And you might think, well, that's not a big deal. Except what if you add a module after you've written 100,000, well, you probably haven't written 100,000 lines of Perl code, but let's say you've written 2,000 lines of Perl code. You add a new module, it exports a variable that, oops, oh darn it, just happens to conflict with one of yours. So you tend not to. Of course, they could also be exporting names that conflict, but whatever. Okay. So the rest of it is for your own personal enjoyment. There's tons of modules. They're at the CPAN site. You can edit Perl files from the command line. God knows I never do, but it's cool. You can read about it. I'm certainly not going to hold you responsible for it. So more. Yes, there is so much more you can do with Perl, but we're not going to go into it in this course. So, questions? Okay, so you are free to go, but